On August 4, 1945, a group of Soviet schoolchildren presented the U.S. ambassador a carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States that stood nearly 2 feet tall. The children, members of the Vladimir Lenin All-Union Pioneer Organization, smiled as they offered this token of appreciation to America's wartime ally. The seal was initially set aside with other diplomatic gifts, but some months later, a staffer whose identity remains unknown decided to hang it in the ambassador's residential study, positioning it directly behind where U.S. Ambassador Harriman would conduct the most sensitive conversations of the early Cold War. What Harriman could not have known was that hidden within the intricately carved wood, nestled beneath the eagle's beak, lay one of the most sophisticated listening devices ever conceived, a technological marvel that would compromise American diplomatic communications for the next 7 years. The wooden seal hung in the study at Spaso House, the residence of the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, as the alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States began its slow, inevitable fracture. W. Averell Harriman, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, was a businessman turned diplomat. He had arrived in Moscow in October 1943 at President Roosevelt's personal request, tasked with maintaining the fragile cooperation necessary to defeat Germany. The residence itself, a neoclassical mansion built before the Russian Revolution, had become the nerve center of American diplomatic efforts in the Soviet Union. Its rooms filled with classified documents, strategic discussions, and the constant flow of officials shuttling between Washington and Moscow. The seal witnessed it all. Positioned where every conversation about Soviet intentions, American strategy, and the emerging tensions over Eastern Europe would unfold within inches of its carved surface. Harriman held meetings in that study with military attachés discussing Soviet troop movements, with State Department officials debating post-war policy, with visiting congressmen trying to understand Stalin's true intentions. The device inside the seal remained dormant during these early months, waiting to be activated by a signal that had not yet been sent, but the placement was perfect. The trap was fully set. Throughout 1946, as Harriman prepared to leave Moscow and return to Washington, the seal remained mounted on the wall, transferred seamlessly to his successor. The new ambassador, a career diplomat with less of Harriman's personal relationship with Stalin, conducted his own sensitive discussions in that same study, unaware that the decorative gift from Soviet children had become something far more sinister. The technology inside the seal was revolutionary for its time, a passive cavity resonator that required no batteries, no wires, no internal power source that might be detected by the standard counter-surveillance equipment of the era. It was a ghost, invisible to every debugging sweep, waiting in silence for Soviet operators to aim their illuminating radio signal at the residents from a nearby building or van. When that signal reached the device, sound waves from conversations in the study would cause a thin membrane inside the seal to vibrate, modulating the reflected radio waves back to Soviet receivers where technicians could decode every word spoken in what the Americans believed to be a secure space. The device had been designed by Léon Harriman, a Russian inventor whose name would become famous in the West for creating the ethereal electronic musical instrument that bore his name, but whose true genius had been channeled into darker purposes. After returning to the Soviet Union from the United States in 1938, Harriman had been arrested, suspected of crimes against the state, and imprisoned in a sharashka, one of the secret Soviet research laboratories where scientists and engineers worked under guard to develop technology for the military and intelligence services. It was in this environment, working under the constant threat of execution, that Harriman had conceived of a listening device so elegant in its simplicity that it would baffle Western intelligence agencies for years after its discovery. The passive resonant cavity required no compromising elements, no radio emissions that could be traced, no power consumption that could be measured. It existed in a state of perfect dormancy until activated from the outside, and in this dormant state, it was functionally undetectable. By 1947, the Cold War had crystallized from wartime suspicion into open hostility, and the study at Spaso House became an even more critical location for American diplomatic communications. Secretary of State George Marshall himself used the room during his visit to Moscow for the Council of Foreign Ministers, preferring its quiet arrangement to the busier spaces in the embassy building. Marshall, architect of the plan that would rebuild Western Europe and contain Soviet expansion, conducted meetings in that study about the future of Germany, the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe, and the growing American commitment to blocking communist expansion wherever it appeared. The seal hung silently on the wall behind him, its hidden device now fully operational. Soviet intelligence officers listening to every word of Marshall's deliberations, gaining invaluable insight into American strategic thinking at the highest levels. The intelligence harvest was extraordinary, providing Moscow with advanced knowledge of American negotiating positions, internal debates about Soviet intentions, and the full scope of discussions about containment policy as it was being formulated. The Soviets operated the device with careful discipline, illuminating it only when high-value targets were in the room, avoiding patterns that might draw attention or suspicion. A van would park near Spaso House, or operators would work from a nearby building with clear line of sight to the ambassador's residence, aiming their transmitter at the precise location where the seal hung. The membrane inside would vibrate with the sound waves of American voices. The cavity would resonate, and the modulated signal would reflect back to Soviet receivers, where it could be demodulated and recorded. Ambassador after ambassador worked in that study, each one conducting the business of American diplomacy, while the seal captured every unguarded moment, every frank assessment, every strategic debate that the State Department believed was occurring in a secure environment. The Americans had begun to suspect Soviet eavesdropping in general terms, operating under the assumption that Moscow routinely monitored foreign diplomats, but the specific means remained unknown. Standard debugging equipment of the era looked for radio transmissions, for electrical current, for metallic components that might indicate a hidden microphone. The Great Seal bug, being entirely passive and containing only a small antenna and resonant cavity, produced none of these telltale signatures. It was a perfect blind spot in American counterintelligence capabilities, a gap that Soviet engineers had identified and exploited with remarkable ingenuity. The first hint that something might be wrong came not from American counterintelligence, but from an accident of technology. In late 1951, a British radio operator monitoring Soviet military air traffic in Moscow picked up voices on his receiver that he recognized coming through on a frequency that should have carried only Russian military communications. The operator, confused by the anomaly, reported it to his superiors, noting that the conversations appeared to be coming from inside the British embassy. The diplomatic wireless service investigated, but found nothing during their initial sweeps. The incident was puzzling enough to be shared with American counterparts, who began to wonder whether similar compromises might exist in their own facilities. Shortly thereafter, an American signals intelligence officer monitoring military radio frequencies picked up American voices that seemed to originate from Spaso House, the same unexplained phenomenon of diplomatic conversations bleeding into Soviet military channels. These incidents triggered a new round of debugging efforts in early 1951, more thorough than previous routine sweeps, but still relying on conventional detection methods that looked for active radio transmitters or electrical signals. Nothing was found during these searches because the investigators were looking for the wrong signatures, assuming that any listening device would need internal power and would transmit continuously rather than reflecting an external signal when activated. The technology being employed by the Soviets was simply too novel, too far outside the paradigm of what Western counterintelligence expected to be detected by standard means. The searchers concluded with the reassuring but incorrect assessment that the premises were clean, leaving diplomats to continue their work under the false belief that their conversations remained private. Two State Department security officers, John W. Ford and Joseph Bezjian, arrived in Moscow in March 1951 with more sophisticated equipment and a different approach to the problem. Ford, a career security officer, and Bezjian, an electronics technician of Armenian descent who had joined the State Department after wartime service, understood that the mysterious radio intercepts suggested something unusual, possibly a passive device that only activated when illuminated from outside. This theory was informed by recent intelligence suggesting that Soviet engineers were experimenting with resonant cavity technology, though no working examples had yet been captured and analyzed. The two men conducted sweeps of the British and Canadian embassies as well as American facilities, using signal generators and sensitive receivers configured to detect not just outgoing transmissions, but any modulation of external signals passing through the rooms they inspected. The investigation proceeded methodically through various embassy spaces, finding nothing conclusive, but continuing to detect anomalous radio behavior that suggested some kind of sophisticated surveillance was occurring. Bezjian, who would later earn the nickname the Rug Merchant among his colleagues for his patient, systematic approach to technical security, developed a working theory about how a passive device might function and what signatures it would produce when activated. The challenge was that such a device would be essentially invisible when not illuminated, making it impossible to locate through passive scanning. The team would need to conduct active testing, generating signals at various frequencies while monitoring for any unusual reflection or modulation that might indicate the presence of a hidden resonator. This approach required time, patience, and the cooperation of embassy personnel willing to participate in elaborate testing protocols that might ultimately reveal nothing at all. Ambassador George F. Kennan arrived in Moscow in May 1952 to take up his post, returning to the city where he had served earlier in his career and where he had developed his theories about Soviet behavior that would shape American containment policy. Kennan, by this time one of the most influential voices on Soviet affairs in Washington, moved into Spaso House with full awareness that the residence had been recently renovated by Soviet workers, a standard practice that everyone assumed involved the installation of listening devices. He ordered new security sweeps using the latest equipment, but once again, the searches revealed nothing definitive. The apparent innocence of the residence was almost suspicious in itself, suggesting either that Soviet practices had changed dramatically or that American detection capabilities remained inadequate. The discovery, when it finally came, was the result of a carefully planned operation involving Kennan himself. Joseph Bezjian returned to Moscow in September 1952, this time with a specific protocol designed to test for passive resonant devices. On September 12th, in a pre-arranged plan, Kennan sat at his desk in the study and began reading aloud from a published State Department document, while Bezjian, posing as a house guest, monitored radio frequencies from elsewhere in the residence. As Kennan droned through the text, his voice steady and unhurried, Bezjian's sensitive receiver began picking up modulated signals, the ambassador's words being reflected back on a microwave frequency. The signal appeared to originate from somewhere near Kennan's position, and as Bezjian moved through the study with his equipment, the strongest return came from the wall where the wooden seal hung. What followed has been described in various accounts with slightly different details, but the essential facts remain consistent. Bezjian, communicating through signs and whispers, indicated to Kennan that something was transmitting his voice and that he should continue reading. He left briefly to retrieve John Ford, and the two men worked methodically around the room, confirming that the signal emanated from the area where the Great Seal was mounted. When Bezjian removed the wooden carving from the wall, expecting to find the device hidden in the masonry behind it, the signal cut out entirely. The realization struck him immediately. The bug was not in the wall, but in the seal itself. With Kennan continuing his recitation, Bezjian opened the wooden seal and discovered the cylindrical metal device mounted inside, positioned beneath the eagle's beak, where tiny holes allowed sound to reach the membrane. The device was photographed, documented, and carefully removed from its wooden housing. That night, Bezjian slept with the bug under his pillow, concerned that Soviet agents might attempt to retrieve it before it could be shipped to Washington for analysis. The discovery represented both a major security breach and a significant intelligence opportunity. The Americans now had, in their possession, a technology that had completely evaded detection for 7 years, a device whose operating principles would need to be understood, replicated, and countered. The bug was dispatched to Washington, where it became the subject of intense analysis by the FBI, CIA, Naval Research Laboratory, and British intelligence agencies who were called in to assist with the examination. The device that arrived in Washington bewildered the technical experts assigned to analyze it. At first glance, it appeared impossibly simple. A small cylindrical cavity with a thin membrane on one end, a quarter-wavelength antenna, and no electronic components whatsoever. There were no batteries, no wires, no transistors, or vacuum tubes, nothing that conventional understanding would identify as necessary for a functioning listening device. The analysts initially struggled to understand how it could possibly work, running tests that produced inconsistent results because they were illuminating it at the wrong frequencies or with insufficient power. The breakthrough came when British technician Peter Wright, working for the Marconi Company and later to become an MI5 counterintelligence officer, took charge of the investigation and successfully operated the device using an illuminating frequency of approximately 800 megahertz. Wright's analysis revealed the elegant simplicity of Harriman's design. The cavity acted as a resonator, carefully dimensioned to respond to specific microwave frequencies. Sound waves from conversations would strike the thin membrane, causing it to vibrate and thereby changing the cavity's resonant characteristics. When an external radio signal at the correct frequency was beamed at the device, these variations in the cavity would modulate the reflected signal, essentially encoding the sound waves onto the returning microwave beam. A receiver tuned to pick up this modulated reflection could then decode the audio, allowing remote listening with no trace except during the brief periods when the device was actively illuminated. The genius of the design lay in its complete passivity. Without the external illuminating signal, the device was simply a piece of metal in a wooden carving, producing no emissions and requiring no power. The implications were profound and disturbing. The FBI determined that the seal contained evidence of an earlier listening device as well, a larger cavity that had apparently housed a more conventional battery-powered bug at some point, suggesting that the Soviets had been monitoring the ambassador's study through multiple generations of technology. More concerning was the realization that if the Soviets had developed this passive resonator technique, they could have deployed similar devices in embassies and consulates around the world, all of them sitting dormant and undetectable until activated from nearby locations. A comprehensive review of American facilities in Soviet bloc countries was immediately ordered, using the new understanding of passive device signatures to guide more effective searches. The analysis also led to rapid development of countermeasures and, more ambitiously, attempts to replicate and improve upon the Soviet technology. Wright and his colleagues developed a similar British system, codenamed Satyr, which was subsequently shared with American, Canadian, and Australian intelligence services for use in their own operations. The passive resonator concept proved so effective that variations of it would be deployed by Western intelligence throughout the 1950s, turning Soviet innovation back against its originators. The discovery had effectively leveled the playing field, providing Western agencies with both the means to detect these devices and the capability to deploy their own versions. However, the question remained of how much damage had been done during the 7 years that the Great Seal bug had operated undetected in the ambassador's study. The Americans faced a difficult calculus about what to do with their discovery. The bug represented both a security catastrophe and a potential propaganda opportunity, but revealing its existence would confirm to the Soviets that their operation had been compromised, while also exposing the extent of American vulnerability. For the time being, the decision was made to keep the discovery classified, sharing information only with close allies and using the intelligence gained from analyzing the device to improve security at diplomatic facilities worldwide. Ambassador Kennan continued his duties in Moscow, though his tenure would be cut short by a diplomatic incident unrelated to the bugging operation. In September 1952, shortly after the bug's discovery, Kennan made an offhand comparison between conditions at the ambassador's residence and his experience being interned by the Germans during World War II, a remark that the Soviets interpreted as a grave insult and used as justification to declare him persona non grata. The bug itself went through various custody chains, being analyzed, documented, and eventually damaged during handling, as curious investigators examined the thin membrane that served as its microphone. The membrane had to be replaced for the device to function in demonstrations, and at some point, the original artifact was separated from the wooden seal that had concealed it. The question of what intelligence the Soviets had actually obtained during the bug's operational period remained largely a matter of speculation. A Soviet intelligence officer later acknowledged that the device had provided valuable information about American diplomatic strategy during crucial years of the Cold War, allowing Moscow to adjust its own positions with advanced knowledge of Washington's likely responses. The conversations captured included high-level strategic discussions, personal assessments of Soviet leaders, debates about military capabilities and nuclear weapons policy, and frank evaluations of America's willingness to confront Soviet expansionism in various regions. The damage assessment concluded that virtually every significant policy discussion that occurred in the ambassador's study between 1945 and 1952 should be considered compromised. This included Marshall's deliberations during the 1947 Council of Foreign Ministers, discussions about the Berlin blockade and airlift, debates over NSC-68 and the expansion of America's military capabilities, and countless conversations about intelligence operations, diplomatic strategy, and political assessments that Moscow would have found immensely valuable. The Soviets had essentially been listening to American policymakers think out loud during the most formative years of the Cold War, gaining insights not just into specific decisions, but into the underlying logic, fears, and constraints that shaped American strategy. The full extent of this intelligence coup would never be completely known, but its impact on the early Cold War was certainly significant. Security protocols at American diplomatic facilities were completely overhauled in response to the discovery. The State Department established more rigorous standards for debugging operations, invested in new detection equipment specifically designed to identify passive resonators, and implemented strict procedures for handling gifts and decorative items that might conceal surveillance devices. A new generation of security officers trained in the latest electronic intelligence techniques was deployed to embassies around the world with orders to assume that any space could be compromised and to verify rather than trust. The culture of diplomatic security fundamentally changed, moving from a somewhat gentlemanly assumption that certain norms would be observed to a hardened recognition that espionage knew no such boundaries. The Great Seal bug remained a closely guarded secret until the spring of 1960, when international events created a perfect opportunity to reveal its existence. On May 1, 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers over Sverdlovsk, approximately 200 miles inside Soviet territory. Powers, who had been conducting a reconnaissance mission photographing Soviet military installations, survived the shoot-down and was captured, providing the Soviets with both a live pilot and the wreckage of one of America's most sophisticated intelligence collection platforms. The incident became an immediate international crisis, destroying the Paris summit between President Eisenhower and Premier Khrushchev that had been scheduled for later that month, and providing Moscow with a propaganda windfall as they denounced American aggression and espionage. The Soviet Union convened an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council to condemn the U-2 flights and demand international censure of American intelligence operations. Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko delivered a withering speech about American perfidy, claiming that the spy flights proved Washington's aggressive intentions and disrespect for international law. For 3 days, Soviet diplomats hammered away at American violations of Soviet airspace, presenting evidence of the U-2 program and demanding accountability. The Americans found themselves in an awkward position, unable to deny the obvious reality of the intelligence collection missions while trying to minimize the diplomatic damage. It was in this context that the decision was made to reveal the Great Seal bug, providing a dramatic counterexample of Soviet espionage that could deflect attention from the U-2 incident. On May 26, 1960, on the fourth day of the Security Council meetings, United States Ambassador to the United Nations Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. took the floor and produced the wooden carving of the Great Seal. Lodge, a skilled diplomat and former senator who understood the value of dramatic presentation, explained to the assembled delegates and the watching world how Soviet schoolchildren had presented this gift to Ambassador Harriman in 1945, how it had hung in the ambassador's study for 7 years, and how it had concealed a sophisticated listening device that allowed the Soviets to monitor America's most sensitive diplomatic conversations. He opened the seal to show the cavity where the bug had been mounted, described how the passive device operated without batteries or wires, and revealed that American security officers had discovered more than 100 concealed listening devices in embassies and residences in Soviet bloc countries during recent years. The revelation achieved its intended effect, completely undermining the Soviet narrative about American espionage being uniquely aggressive or improper. Lodge's presentation demonstrated that both superpowers engaged in extensive intelligence collection operations, that the Soviets had been conducting sophisticated surveillance for years, and that Moscow's outrage over the U-2 flights was fundamentally hypocritical. The Soviet delegation attempted to dismiss Lodge's claims as unfounded, but the physical evidence of the bug and the detailed explanation of how it had been discovered made denial impossible. The Security Council voted down the Soviet resolution, condemning the United States by a vote of 7-2, with only Poland voting alongside the Soviets. The Great Seal bug had served its propaganda purpose, deflecting international criticism and exposing Soviet intelligence operations to public scrutiny. The public revelation of the Great Seal bug fundamentally changed the landscape of Cold War espionage, forcing both sides to acknowledge openly what had previously been conducted in shadow. The device itself became a symbol of the technological cat-and-mouse game that characterized the intelligence contest between superpowers, a reminder that innovation and deception were as important as raw collection capability. The story of how Soviet children had presented this so-called gift, how it had evaded detection for 7 years, and how its eventual discovery had required new thinking about what a listening device could be, captured public imagination and became a staple of Cold War history. The original bug, or what remained of it after various analyses and handling, eventually ended up in the custody of the National Security Agency, though its exact current location remains unclear. A faithful replica is displayed at the National Cryptologic Museum in Fort Meade, Maryland, where visitors can examine its construction and understand the principles behind Harriman's ingenious design. For Léon Harriman himself, the Great Seal bug represented just one chapter in a remarkable and tragic life that spanned the century. After his release from the Sharashka in 1947, he continued working for Soviet intelligence agencies, developing additional surveillance technologies that remain classified. He taught at the Moscow Conservatory, raised a family, and survived the Stalin era to see the Soviet Union's eventual collapse. In 1991, shortly before his death, at age 97, Harriman traveled to the United States, where he was reunited with Clara Rockmore, the virtuoso who had championed his musical instrument, and received recognition for his contributions to electronic music. The darker aspects of his work for Soviet intelligence were acknowledged, but viewed with understanding of the impossible circumstances under which he had operated. His invention of the passive resonator bug remained his most significant contribution to the intelligence world, a design so elegant that variations of it continue to influence electronic surveillance technology. The individuals involved in the Great Seal bug story continued their careers in intelligence and diplomacy, carrying with them the lessons learned from this episode. Joseph Bezjian, the security officer who finally located the device, continued his work in technical surveillance countermeasures, later serving in Egypt before retiring to Florida. George Kennan's diplomatic career was cut short by the persona non grata incident, but he went on to become one of the most influential historians and theorists of the Cold War, his memoirs providing valuable insights into the period when the bug was operating. Peter Wright's work analyzing the device launched him into a long career with MI5, though his later years were marked by controversy when he published Spycatcher, his memoir exposing what he viewed as institutional failures in British intelligence. The Great Seal bug touched all their lives, a perfect example of how a single piece of technology could influence careers, policies, and the course of Cold War history. The legacy of the Great Seal bug endures in museums, in intelligence training programs, in security protocols that still account for the possibility of passive surveillance devices, and in the historical record of Cold War espionage. It stands as one of the most successful intelligence operations of the era, a technological triumph that provided the Soviet Union with years of invaluable diplomatic intelligence while remaining completely undetected. Its eventual discovery and public revelation came to symbolize the hidden dimensions of superpower competition, the ingenuity of engineers working under pressure, and the constant need for vigilance in protecting sensitive communications. More than 6 decades after Joseph Bezjian pulled the wooden seal from the wall at Spaso House, the story continues to resonate. A reminder that in the world of intelligence, the most effective operations are often those that hide in plain sight, that the most dangerous listening devices are those that make no sound, and that assumptions about security can persist long after security itself has been compromised.